Hello, I'm Susan. I'm from Worldpeacefull, and I'm going to talk about unemployment today. And actually, it's not just because the Australian budget's just come down last night, but I've actually been reflecting on unemployment for a couple of days. In particular, a poem that I wrote quite a few years ago. I'm an economist by training, and I've also been unemployed. I have really deep concerns about the way welfare has shifted from social security to work for the dole type programs, where it's become more job-based rather than a safety net that it used to be when it was called CES, and I remember it when it was CES. And the idea was that we couldn't have full employment, and as a result of that, we had to have a social safety net for those who were not able to be employed because there were no jobs. It is a way of creating social stability as well, and not only that, the payments that come to people who are on welfare actually go directly into the local economy. So it actually pump primes the economy. It's actually good for economic growth because the money typically doesn't go into overseas holidays or investment properties. It typically goes into the local market. It's also, from a philosophical perspective, it's the sign of a civilized society to help those, and I won't say the word less privileged, I'll say the word who have not been given the skills or perhaps do not have the skills and abilities to work in the mainstream. We live in a highly diverse society. In Australia, it's multicultural, so not only are you dealing with language barriers, gender barriers, educational barriers, cultural barriers, religious barriers, there's enormous barriers to entry, is what we call it in economics, into the working life. Now, I'm 52 years old. I remember when it was very easy to get work. I worked in 400 companies myself over a period of around 10 years. I've worked as an analyst. And in those days, you could actually walk into a job. In terms of even doing recruitment type jobs, it was very easy to get work. Nowadays, the whole human resource approach has completely shifted. So where you could actually be given a go and at least learn new skills on the job and be paid, today there is very stringent criteria set out by HR. There's huge competition given the job providers having job seekers applying for jobs they don't want, 30 a fortnight. So you've got 30 applicants for each job, for more than that, you'd have about 150 applicants for each job in truth. But let's just say that each person has to apply for 30 jobs they don't want. The recipient of those applications has to sift through additional work in order to find those who are genuinely seeking that job that they're advertising. It's highly unproductive. It's very onerous. And what it does is within the job seeker, it actually creates an attitude of I won't get a job because they get knocked back endlessly. It's the knockbacks that create the disempowerment. And when you have job providers acting like parents, even to adults, it immediately gives you the sense that you have no power. And as a result of that, it's going to be very hard to envisage yourself working. And that's not understood as a psychological impact on job seekers. And I've spoken to quite a few who have been absolutely disillusioned with the system itself. The Work for the Dole program, whilst I think as an initial impetus to give people a go at trying work who have been out of work for a long time, providing it's productive work and can lead them to a job, I think for a few weeks that's fine. The idea of enforcing people to work is bordering on slavery, and it actually contravenes Section 51, subsection 23 of the Australian Constitution, which means that you cannot conscript people into work. You can do it for the military, but you can't do it for work. It's called freedom, and this, of course, is what democracy is based on. But what I'm seeing is more compliance-type mentalities in respect of those in the governance of the system who have really no idea of the changing realities on the ground. We also are in a global economy that is in decline. We're seeing major issues with the oil industry in decline, as we've seen with coal here in Australia, in which we are a commodities exporter. We're seeing that we're actually losing wealth, because that's the backbone of Australia, has been the commodities sector. In terms of wealth, in terms of economics, we talk about value adding, and often countries that have been engaged in manufacture have tended to be the ones who have made money, such as China, who have replaced many of the Asian tigers now. Asian tigers are still going, but China is a very large producer now. They've also bought up lots of resources around the world. So we've got a lot of economic conditionings happening around the world where there are new entrants into global markets who have cheap labour, and they typically get the edge in certain market segments. We've also got online world occurring, so there's a lot of business being transacted online where people are selling, and therefore the need for shop fronts is disappearing. So we're seeing retail sales falling as global retail outlets occur online. So we're seeing a complete refiguration of economic system. Now, paralleled with that is ecological collapse. Now, I'm not wishing to sound like a doomsday naysayer. I actually have a positive, optimistic outlook, which I will share with you in a moment. But there are some realities that people have to face. The ecological crisis is being driven in part by human-induced climate change. There's also cosmic events happening through solar flares from the sun, which in my opinion is affecting climate as well. But in terms of the ecological balance on the planet, humans undoubtedly have caused all sorts of imbalances. Now, the reason that is because we are out of harmony with our true nature. Now, when I say that, what I'm saying is our true nature is positive. Our true nature is loving and giving to one another. You only have to look at children to know that this is true. They naturally give. They'll do your picture and they'll give it. They don't even think twice. They're not going, oh, that's my picture. Although they do go through the stage of mine, but that's part of their development. That's not intrinsic in the human nature, which is essentially loving and giving and compassionate. What we have been trained into is more fear-based behaviours, which make us insecure about our things. It makes us insecure about other people. The media is fed into that, so we don't trust our neighbours anymore. We think the world is a very dangerous place. I've travelled the world. It is not a dangerous place. It's actually, everyone's quite like us. All the same sort of issues that they're having. They just speak different languages and have cultural differences. So what my point is with peace is our true nature. We are out of step with the planet because of the economic system, which has been driven from the Industrial Revolution. Essentially, the core of that was to create economies of scale, which would bring prices down and that we could all afford things. That was the essential principle. It was really about removing power from, at that time, the mercantilists. We're talking, 18th century, where power was accumulating with traders, trading companies. So the whole Keynesian type of economics was really about putting the government at the centre to be able to distribute more fairly through the taxation system and through income, well, that was income generation and various costs that government, faced in terms of running infrastructure in a society. So in those days, under those principles, the idea was fairness. It was actually to ensure the welfare of the people. What we're seeing today is increasing selfishness. We're seeing very narrow mindsets, very conservative mindsets in management, leadership, governance, where they're only accustomed to their own world. And that world is a very wealthy world where they see those who have fallen beneath as somehow in the sphere of losers. Yes, in terms of economics, they are indeed at a disadvantage. There's no question about that. Even socially, they're at a disadvantage. They get judged very quickly. But what we really wanted to aim for initially was more egalitarianism, which is called equality. What we wanted, certainly as a country, was fairness in terms of people being able to do fair work for a fair day's pay. What we're seeing is people working overtime, the intense pressures on people to work full-time. They can't look after their children, and what we're seeing is more and more children being raised in daycare centres, which is not for their highest good, and it's not, because I've been in these centres. They do the best they can, the centres, and they probably teach more important social skills to children. The children need their parents is really the point I'm driving at. They miss their parents. And what we're seeing, again, is a dissection of the parent from the child as the parent's forced into work because of an operating paradigm that says everyone should work. Well, no, I disagree with that. I think we need better social planning. I tend to look at Switzerland and Sweden, the Nordic countries, even aspects of the European Union, have better social policies in terms of dealing with the social crises and preventing social crises by ensuring safety nets, ensuring people are looked after and are given access to the various things they want to do in their life. It's not all about economics, and harking back to the environmental collapse, it's connected to overconsumption. So we're buying more and more things, living in bigger and bigger houses, more and more around the world given credit, are accessing more monies in order to consume more. That is what's sinking the planet. So this is not working, is essentially my point. The system is not working. We keep regurgitating the same ideas, and we see that in the political sphere. It's the same thing, jobs, jobs, jobs. That's all they ever talk about, not gross national happiness. They don't talk about the social ills that are really happening on the ground. The drug issue is a reflection of people trying to find happiness, who are getting hooked onto drugs because they've been so detached from their own self. A lot of the young ones now are on their phones. They are not noticing people. They're losing empathy. This is a breeding ground for bullying. They become socially inept because they're not having to communicate with other people. They're becoming more insecure. The media and movie industry and video industry is pumping out a lot of violence, which makes them even more frightened. So what you're finding is that they're actually shutting down. Job market's harder to access. They're falling into the peripheral. They lose hope. And that's what we're setting up for the next generation. Is this what we want? Now, as I promised, talk about the more positive side. The world is going to go and is going through enormous change, and there's a lot of fear around this. We as communities have to come together and start talking about the fears that we have and how we are going to work together. We have to look at what is in the best interest of everyone, not just self-interest. Are we able to create more social enterprises that feed money back into society, certain percentages back into society, to assist with the welfare of people? Welfare is not dole bludgeoning. Welfare is well-being, the well-being of people. Let's drop the word welfare and call it well-being. When people are looked after, one of my strategies is, why don't we pay everyone the dole, Centrelink? Welfare, everyone, including wealthy people. Pay everyone a living income. Then you will find your healthcare costs will go down. People won't be going to the doctor as much. Their basics are met. Now from there, they then are encouraged and empowered to go for what they actually want. Now, when someone really loves something and they're passionate, they will work for nothing. They will do whatever in order to make that dream come true. We all have dreams. These dreams have been shelved in favour of working 9-to-5 jobs because of these economic imperatives. We have to recalibrate. We have to completely shift this system to focus on an outcome of gross national happiness, not gross domestic product, gross national happiness. Happiness is the social stabilizer. When people are happy, they give more to each other. They, through their celebration of life, they expand more. Richard Branson would be a very good example of someone who's celebrating life and who's trying to spread his enthusiasm across the world, getting young people to become more entrepreneurial, to come up with innovative ideas. Edward de Bono was another such leader. He was phenomenal in terms of creating lateral thinking. He talked about the 6 thinking hats, parallel thinking, where we might put on the yellow hat of optimism altogether and we work out optimistically what do we see, what can we create, and then brainstorm it. He might have put the black hat on of, more critical thinking, because you've got to critically think things. Might have looked at the white hat of facts. He had all these different coloured hats, the 6 thinking hats. Now, this was another way of problem solving. Now, one of the weaknesses in what I've seen, certainly in my own society, is that we're not good at problem solving. We're good at using legal devices in order to get our way. The control paradigm is very much alive, and we've got to step away from that and start to move towards collaboration, communication, conflict resolution, and respect of one another. Now, just because a person is not working doesn't mean they failed. I would actually argue that the system itself is failing people, and they're being pauperised as a result, and mental health issues are arising. The drug situation or alcohol situation is a substitute for them because they really believe that they've failed. They need our support, not condemnation. And it could be you. You might be in a nice job right now, but tomorrow you might not be if the global economy collapses. You could all be in the same position. So it's easy to judge in one's armchair when one has their rent paid and a cushy job, although I suspect most people are in stressful jobs now. So what I would advocate for is that it's time to take our heads out of the sand, everyone. Contribution to the system is actually for the welfare of everyone. It's not just about making money in order to pay off your mortgage, because often that's used as an argument for holding people with jobs in higher status than those of lower status in terms of unemployment, because they're saying, well, they're paying taxes, they're paying for the system. Well, everyone's paying GST, we're all paying taxes. So that argument's gone. I think now we have to come back to a much more deeply considered perspective of what brings happiness to all people. I would like to see us working part-time on 3/4 of the full-time wage, and as I said, with a global basic wage that everyone is paid so that their basics are covered. Their rent and a modest part of the mortgage is paid. But at the end of the day, it creates an equal and level playing field. Education, we're going to have to highly subsidise that to make sure that it's accessible by everyone. What we're seeing today is the universities are now getting more and more focused on overseas students. Local students are not getting the same access. They're having to pay upfront fees more and more as users pay infiltrates a public good. In economics, we call universities, roads, water, electricity, telephone, all these things were called public goods because they were provided to the public. And the idea of the government provision of this was to cross-subsidise to ensure that everyone had equal access. The healthcare system is another. The Medicare system was created by this. But what we're seeing, in my opinion, is the infiltration of rational economics, which is all about market forces. It's still very much alive, unfortunately. We saw this in the Reagan and Thatcher eras, and they absolutely decimated welfare because they had a predominant belief system that people were lazy, that people need to be forced into work, and they also wanted access to cheap labour force. But that is not government serving society, that is society serving an economic system. That was not the original principle of economics. The point of economics was to redistribute fairly so everyone had equal access. Now, you may want to listen to this video a few times because I've given you a lot of information on what these bases were out of which economic system arose. And as I've tried to explain to people listening to this, we've created inequalities through it, which are unreal, they're illusionary. We are all equal. People are not failures because they don't get work. Whenever I've received an email saying I failed to get a job, I've never believed that for a second. They failed to see my merit. I have plenty of merit. And I know because of my high skill base that I'm highly employable, but even I had trouble even getting an interview. Also, my age worked against me. All these erroneous barriers were placed in the way because people were looking at criteria. They weren't looking at people. They weren't looking at enthusiasm, innovation, creativity. All these things are just sidelined for, have you got a certificate in this? Have you got a degree in that? How long have you been in this? In previous times, what actually happened was the companies were training internally, therefore they're quite happy to bring people in without a qualification. This actually made a flexible employer market. They talk about labour flexibility, but they never talk about employer flexibility. What about flexi time? We have every car conceivable coming into a city at the same time. Starting work at 9, finishing 5 or 6 o'clock now here in Australia. We're probably the longest workers in the Western countries, and if not later. Why is it that we have everyone starting at the same time and finishing at the same time, and then we sit in gridlock traffic jams? I've lived in every city in Australia. They're all gridlock. They have massive problems with infrastructure, massive problems with transport. My solution to that is flexi time. In other words, you clock on when you want and you clock off when you want. You may be asked to work 7 hours a day or 8 hours a day. Clock on, you might start at 10, you might finish at 8, or you might finish at 6, depending on what you're doing. You become the person who governs the times you start and finish. Now, obviously, if there's meetings set, you've got to turn up for those. But with technology, we can Skype. We have the ability to use technology more wisely so people don't actually have to go into work. They can be remote. So if everybody was working in that way, most people are very unique in that they have different ways of working. Some like morning, some like nighttime. So why don't we allow that to be? Management itself is still stuck in a very old paradigm. Managers typically aren't well educated on the whole. Even in the upper management areas, they become locked into certain mindsets. They're not thinking creatively, and that's what Richard Branson, I think, is a very good example of. And Ricardo Semler, he was the one that designed more flexible workforces. He was another prime mover that I remember studying in economics. You've even got people like George Soros, who was a great financier, who's now moving into social policy areas, who's starting to recognise the fallaciousness of unfettered market growth. He's starting to realise we have to actually focus on societies and get it right there. Now, part of this, coming back to some of the solutions too, is it's also to do with the inequality between men and women as well, because we have different mindsets and we do think differently. You can try and force women into thinking like men to work in their environments, but we actually are very different. We have to find ways to utilise the strengths of men and women because that creates homeostasis and balance. Together, we're very balanced. If we're all trying to be like the one, like if women are trying to be like men, young girls are trying to be more violent, more warrior-like, it's not going to work. You have to be who you are. We have to work together. It's not about competing and creating little cliques. It's about learning to work with great diversity. And that's where the peace education comes in. This is another solution. We need to teach people how to resolve conflict inside themselves and between each other. We have to sensitise people to bullying, that's power over, and it actually comes from powerlessness. The person who's bullying is actually powerless. They're seeking power over someone to feel an expansion in their ego, to feel a sense of control because they feel insecure. Those that enjoy it have pathological aspects. They are completely detached, and these could have come from childhood traumas when we're looking at the bullying issue. Now, on the wellbeing side, which is what I'm interested in, we have to help people to know themselves better. They have to start to deal with their issues and stop shutting them down. We have to allow people to speak up at work. We don't call them a troublemaker. We invite their dissension, because in a democracy, a fully functioning and real democracy, we actually believe in the freedom of speech of all people. And what that actually does is it creates contrast and it enables innovation to arise out of it. If we're all frightened into conformity, we then become very much the same. And where someone could have said something that could have made a real difference to that company or that organisation, they lost that idea. We even saw that in the militaries. I've seen, discourse around military decisions that were made where the other people involved in the decision making were too afraid to speak up, and then wars broke out as a result because they didn't want to rock the boat. In the times we're moving through right now, it's time to rock the boat, and I mean it in a very positive way. I'm not saying it as a means of rebellion. I'm saying it in a means of it's gently speaking up. Do it non-violently, but you have to say what you think. No more burying the head in the sand. If you're unhappy with the way society is, don't go down the pub. Start a meet-up. Get people talking. Talk to unemployed people. Ask them what they want, what the reality on the ground is, what would inspire them to become more innovative in creating their own work. Can they be clustered together in like skill sets? Because you've got people my age who are highly skilled, who could be mentoring young people in skills. But the creativity is not in the bureaucratic structure that's overseeing all this. It's the same mentality that was sitting there in the 1980s and the 1990s when I was young. Same mentality, hasn't changed. If anything, it's becoming more conservative and more remote from the reality on the ground. We have to think very carefully about slave labour. I visited bonded labour camps in India where they worked their hands to the bone. They worked for free. Work for the doll's all very nice, and it's great to get kids working, but if they're packing and making Christmas presents, or they're in areas that's not related to work, well, then you're talking slavery, and that has to be addressed. That is not a reflection of a democratic society. So we as a society have to sit down very carefully at this point in time and think about what sort of society do we want? Do we want a supportive, friendly, peaceful, collaborative, kind, empathetic, inspiring society to live in? Or are we going to shut each other down with technology? Are we going to live in fear? Are we going to become more polarized between the haves and the have-nots? And this, of course, is always the seed that creates insurrection. You don't want that. Now, as things start to change globally, and we know we're going through transitional times, that is a fact. Everybody knows. I was up in the Himalayas, ice caps are melting. We're in transitional times. There is going to be big change. We have to come down from the ivory towers, get down on the ground, start to talk to people. We do not fear the broaching of the conversation of the transitional times we're moving through. Everyone has to talk about this. We have to work out strategies with climate change. I did research, I remember, in South Australia on pandemics, emergency response. How do we deal with that? If the oceans rise, if an axis shifts, if there's a pole shift, as Einstein stated, let's start a public discourse about it. What do we do? How do we maintain peace in our society? Or do we allow fear to dictate? Do we still try and control as a means of social order, or do we find ways to collaborate in a democratic framework, which is why I think democracy did work in the beginning so effectively, particularly in the US, with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Founding fathers over there really did have a very clear idea of liberty, what freedom really meant. Unfortunately, over time it got distorted by industrialists with special interests who pursued their own selfish strategies at the expense of the public. It's not hard for people to work this out now on the internet. All the information's out there. But what I would say to young people is don't despair. Life does unfold in a magical way. I've travelled myself a lot, and I've been homeless too. And what I can say to you is somehow, some way, life will present something to you. It's a very dynamic world we're in, which is outside of the human controlled paradigm. So I was going to read a poem, which I'll do in the next video. I think this communication I've done now is really just my freedom of speech in response to the confusion that I'm witnessing in our society and the inequality and the conservatism, which I believe is counterproductive if we really want to create a more fruitful and happier society. We have to change the way we think. And that will be up to each person to decide whether they're going to be really consulting with their society or whether they're going to control it. So I'll leave you with that. Be the change you wish to see. And I send peace and love to everyone. And in truth, our happy destiny is unavoidable when we choose positivity. Take care. Bye.